I would like to thank John very, very much for agreeing to give this talk for us today. He was given last minute notice and quite graciously accepted our invitation for him to do that. Thank you very much, John. And if you'll tell us what you're going to be speaking about today, please.
Sure thing. So we're going to be talking about a topic in natural medicine that I'm sure most of you have thought about at least one point or another. And it does have a lot of impact with everybody, whether you work nutritionally or dietary or not. We're going to be talking about protein in practice, and then we're going to be learning about what that means and are we even paying attention to that topic. I think most people it gets overlooked maybe for herbs or something else, but we often miss the dietary component. And I think protein these days is a very important topic to touch on. So hopefully you guys feel the same. All right,
Thank
let's
you.
go. Thank you everyone for your patience. All right, so today we're going to be deepening our understanding on protein and protein's role in the body. And we're going to start to clarify a little bit about how protein status can be evaluated in the clinical setting. And I'm also going to talk about some real world like recommendations or some application. It's pretty simple. I think in general, most of us should know what protein is. So a little bit about me. I am a natural medicine practitioner. I've taken I guess, an unbeaten path, a road that most people haven't gone down. So I have a lot of different perspectives on things. My background is primarily in hair analysis. So I like looking at the minerals in people's hair, and I make a lot of nutritional recommendations based off of those. I'm not really interested in chasing symptoms because I think they can be misleading, but they can certainly provide some context, which I think, is very important. And over the past decade, I've really been working with people all over the world with a lot of chronic health conditions. And yeah, well, that's a little bit about me. Hey. So today's session is going to be on protein in practice. And I really want to, raise that curiosity of what does the body say through its chemistry when it's adapting to stress? Because I feel like a lot of people are in that situation. So you're also going to notice that my approach to this presentation is systems based. It's not necessarily linear. So hopefully we can put together a couple of these concepts and get some aha moments along the way. And we're not going to be looking at isolated deficiencies. So I'm going to talk about like proline or any amino acid like that because it's a bit more complex than what I'm trying to do here. So we'll be talking about digestion, absorption, and liver function, how our glands respond to these sort of things, and the tissue demand itself for protein and how that changes. So protein really is one of the most essential things in the body. It's not really about muscle, except we're always thinking about the muscles when it comes to that topic. It's a structural component, and it's necessary for every cell, every tissue, and every organ system. So if we're working in any sort of health condition, we should probably consider that protein connection with that. It's also helps form our cell membranes. It keeps everything together, as I said, and even inside the cell, there's more proteins, protoplasms. So it's a very important structural component here. But it's important. Its importance is a little bit beyond just structural. It's actually a very highly functional nutrient in the body. It's the raw material that's used to make enzymes. So the stuff that makes things happen in the body, receptors, transporters, antibodies, hormones, yeah, it's a big deal. So a huge number of hormonal signaling actually relies on protein, either as the backbone or for production itself. It's things like steroid hormones, or you can just have proteins that have hormone-like effects becoming a little bit more common these days. This topic is called peptides, BPC, these sort of things. Even the thyroid hormones themselves, which most people should be familiar with, are also, they require an amino acid like tyrosine just to make them. And so when our protein levels in our blood actually falls down low, every system in our body can slow down. All the transportation of hormones, molecules, the digestion of stuff, everything slows down. So proteins rarely work alone. They like team members, community, company. So many of the body's key proteins actually carry or hold other molecules. We have minerals, hormones, fats, or sugars. So when a protein binds to, a mineral like zinc or iron, that becomes an enzyme. And that's a biochemical tool that can drive reactions in the body and move electrons. And when protein is carrying lipids, we call these things lipoproteins. And that's a transport vehicle, again, in the blood that ferries fats throughout the bloodstream, another important component for energy metabolism. And when protein binds with carbohydrates, we get glycoproteins. And these are basically cellular identifiers. So glycoproteins are the recognition tags that immune system or our cell surfaces use to talk and communicate with one another. So each bonded partner with that protein's bound to changes its behavior. Minerals give activity, lipids give mobility to help move things around, and carbohydrates are about communication. So together, they create this coherent, living coherence, that structure that can sense, move, and adapt, probably where we get those things from as well, right? So one of the most clinically relevant points about protein is that there actually is no storage site for it in the body. Unlike fat, which for me, fat gets stored in all the wrong places, right? We can't store protein. And so because it doesn't have that reservoir, that tank to draw from, protein is constantly turning over. So when protein demand rises through stress or trauma or growth or some sort of strain, the body can't just pull from a storage site. Instead, it has to triage protein allocation. So what it does is it breaks down that less critical tissue to meet the more urgent needs on the day-to-day basis. So we're trading that short-term survival for long-term stability. That's a really important concept in a lot of different things in health, if we can grasp triage. But that protein can get pulled from our muscles, our joints, our gut lining, just to sustain like our liver or our immune function, other high priority functions. So assessing protein status is a little bit more nuanced than just making sure you're getting enough in through the diet. It's also about how we digest it, how we absorb it and move it around in our body, and how we retain it across multiple different systems. And if it's being pulled from one area to serve another, that symptoms can arise and they seem like unrelated places. So you can get skin symptoms, joints, joint pain, you can get mood related issues, and even digestion can be compromised if we're not getting enough protein. So now that we've established that protein is this real-time functional resource that's adapting to our body's needs, and we don't really have that storage depot, the next thing we really need to understand is how the body balances that economy. And we use something, in biochemistry, we use nitrogen as a proxy. So every day, just through normal functioning, we're going to be losing losing protein, even if we're in really good health. So that protein turnover just never stops. So intake and loss are in this continuous dialogue, and nitrogen excretion is how we track that exchange. And so what we measure as nitrogen balance is kind of like the ledger we were talking about earlier with the accounting. One side we have the intake, and on the other side we have the loss. So as you can see here, the body's protein economy functions a lot like one of those balancing scales. On the left side, we have the amino acids from the food that are used for growth and repair. And on the other side, we have nitrogen excretion, which is those losses, those obligatory losses we talked about. Now, when the two sides are about equal, that's when the body is capable of maintaining and repair. And we call that a neutral nitrogen balance. When that equilibrium is met, that's what we're looking for in healthy adults. That allows for normal tissue renewal without like an excessive strain or like a depletion occurring for that to happen. Now, if the nitrogen loss is greater than our intake, we slip into something called that negative nitrogen balance. And this is where the body begins to use its own reserves. This is a catabolic state. It's one of the earliest signs that the body is under-resourced. And since protein is so foundational, this imbalance ripples outwards and can affect multiple different systems. We get tissue repair that starts to slow down, our immune system weakens, our hormone production is just, we don't have the raw materials to do it. And even our neurotransmitters, how are we going to have neurotransmitters if we don't have protein? So all these can start to decline and have, systemic multiple system effects. So negative balance is common during, times of excessive strain, illness, surgery, trauma. Really, realistic, it's just chronic stress. And the more we're exposed to that, if we're not being able to meet the demands of that stress, it can deplete us and bring us into this negative balance. So in these states, we're losing more protein than we're bringing in, and our terrain starts to break itself down just so that it can cope. So remember that this loss occurs silently at first. You probably don't notice, hey, I'm in a negative protein balance. Ooh, better fix that. You don't really notice it. And it can be even missed by labs as well. So when you're checking through labs, it might not show that this compensation is occurring. And I think that's a very important thing to remember as well. Um, so it's very hard to improve health if the body is breaking down faster than it's able to recover. So we really don't want people in this negative nitrogen state. So when our intake is more, obviously we're now in a positive balance. This is like that anabolic state that they're trying to do with the bodybuilders and develop more muscle mass that you see people doing, right? It's also really important when you're growing as a child to have a little bit more than what you need so that you can develop and grow your skeleton and meet your your development, pregnancy, or even if you're recovering from an injury. So this is the only real true anabolic phase of protein economy. And in adults, it's not like super common. So the positive balance is what we want during the repair phase. Like we hurt ourselves, broke our arm or something. You want to give yourself a bit more protein than what's the bare minimum just to help with the recovery, right? So when the terrain is regaining strength, this is what we're looking for. Or when repletion is needed after a long depletion. Maybe we had a really long, stressful event that, negatively impacted us. So to maintain health, daily protein losses have to at least match the dietary intake. So when the intake is equal to the loss, that's the neutral, that's the equilibrium that we're looking for maintenance and repair. And our goal in health it isn't really to stay permanently like in a anabolic push towards endless, growth. Realistically, we're looking for oscillation. So we're looking for neutrality a lot of the time, maybe swinging over into a positive balance and some negative, but we're looking for oscillations, not stagnancy, right? So the takeaway here is pretty simple. The balance isn't just about what we're eating. It's about whether that intake is matching the demand that is imposed on our organism. And since we live in very stressful times, I think most people may need to be mindful about their protein intake because under stress, our demand rises, and sometimes that can be dramatic. So we talked about how the intake is a big part, but it's not the whole thing. Of course, we need to look at the in, do, out. So we're going to look at the digestive process. So if someone's eating enough protein, the next step is, well, what goes on with it from there? So protein digestion technically begins before the stomach. Some people say the eyes or the thought of the meal, however you want to think about that. I'm going to say once that protein hits the stomach and it's been chewed, then we need to develop that hydrochloric acid and something called pepsin to start a process called hydrolysis, which is basically like breaking down long protein chains into smaller proteases and polypeptides. But here's the catch. Our stomach acid production is not the same for everyone, and it doesn't stay the same our whole life. So because it can vary across populations and age, it can also vary based off of your nutrient status, the history with stress, maybe you might have genetic components, right? So in practice, many people with this negative balance with their protein intake can often have less stomach acid, and it could be even imposed by the diet themselves where they're not eating adequate protein, and so the body's producing less stomach acid to break down that protein. Okay, and then we often find a lot of people that are in this situation. When they eat more protein, they get this feeling of like really full, or they can't eat their whole meal, or they get really bloated and have air hunger, right? Those are all signs of hypochlorhydria or low stomach acid. So those clients, a lot of the ones that I work with, at least, I find that they often go towards like lighter meals. That might even go towards vegetarianism, and they feel better when they do this. But I think we need to be careful when feeling better because that can be seen as symptom management instead of correcting the underlying issue. So they might be avoiding the foods that are challenging their digestion rather than correcting the underlying reason for why there's a challenge to begin with. So a healthy digestion does not see protein as a burden. It's usually if there's a compromise, it's a burden. So once the stomach empties, digestion continues into the small intestine where the enzymes from the pancreas and brush border enzymes just finish the absorption of those amino acids. If that stomach acid is low, though, the duodenal signal doesn't necessarily trigger the pancreas to release this pancreatic enzyme. And so it can severely limit our absorption of the protein that we're eating. And here's the thing, enzymes are proteins too. So when a protein is deficient, the body can lack the raw materials to build the very enzymes that are needed to digest the protein. And this creates like a self-reinforcing cycle where you have poor digestion leading to low absorption, which reduces enzyme production, leading to poor digestion. And it just keeps happening, right? So if you suspect a protein insufficiency, especially alongside those digestive complaints, again, we don't want to just think that it's a dietary issue of intake, right? Protein insufficiency can impair digestion and limit the enzymes. And so we need to support those phases. So even the high protein diet's not going to solve the hydrochloric production if the acidity is not there. Since protein sufficiency isn't the only thing that we're worried about, we're also worried about bioavailability. What's available for our body to use? So, we need to explore that absorption and potentially the excretion to make sure that our clients are supported properly with, protein metabolism. Now, once it's absorbed, once it's utilized, that maybe it's bioavailable, well, we're going to start talking about metabolism, right? How the body's using these things. Specifically, I think this is a good example of how the liver manages fat, and it uses a lot of protein-derived nutrients to do this. And it really embodies that systems thinking I was talking about earlier. So methionine is one of the essential amino acids, and it's a pretty good example. So it acts as a precursor to choline. Choline, a lot of people use it for memory or for nervous system function these days. Now, it does that through something called acetylcholine. But choline also plays a critical role in fat metabolism in the liver. So in the liver, choline is used to make phosphatidylcholine, lecithin, we used to call it, in the 80s. And that's a key part of the VLDL particles that export fat. Now, when choline intake is low, then fat becomes trapped inside of the liver, and it can lead to fatty changes in the liver. These are things that we call, hepatic steatosis or fatty liver, right? You may have heard these topics. So while many people consider, these like lipid tropes like methionine or choline or inositol as for detoxification, that's not their only role in the liver. They're also really important for the logistics and how the liver utilizes and packages fat and ships it out for other areas in the body. So we do need to make sure that we're ensuring adequate methionine-rich proteins and choline-rich foods. These are things like eggs and organ meats, but if you're going towards plants, you'll find them mostly in the legumes, the beans, that sort of thing. And those are very useful for supporting that proper lipid export from the liver so that it can support the endocrine system for hormone production. So in this context, lipotropes really just help keep the traffic moving, ensuring that fat and hormones can circulate to the right channels. So we talked about digestion and then how protein-derived nutrients can support metabolism in the body and then impact the whole. So really, protein needs to be broken down into things called amino acids. Now, out of the 21 amino acids that the body uses, you only really need 9 that are essential, which means we absolutely have to get them from our food. Otherwise, a nutritional deficiency state can occur. So when the body builds proteins, whether muscle fibers, enzymes, neurotransmitters. We actually need all of the essential amino acids at the same time. And if one of them is missing, or even if it's relatively low, so maybe they're all high, but one is the low, that low one becomes the rate limiter. That's the thing that limits what can happen with that protein. So that can cause protein synthesis to slow, and it can also slow down those repair mechanisms that we talked about. So that's the limiting amino acid effect. And I like to use an example with a barrel. This image has apples in it, which is not going to work for the example too well, but it was the free one that I could get. So basically, the idea with this is like each stave, or like the wooden plank in the barrel that's vertical, that goes around, each one can represent an amino acid. And if one of them is low, then maybe that wood doesn't reach to the top. You couldn't fill that barrel full of wine or whiskey or something, right? Because it's only you can only fill it up to the capacity of the lowest amino acid. So this is why dietary diversity really matters, or at least ensuring that you're getting adequate protein through multiple times in the day, so that you can make sure that you're getting all of the amino acids, and so that there's not that rate limiting ability that's happening there. So we know that protein is not so much about how we eat, but now we're also talking about how we actually need like a full gamut or full spectrum of amino acids so that our body can use it properly. Now, what enables the body to digest, absorb, and utilize it in the first place? And this is really one of my passions, is in micronutrients. So it's my favorite topic. They're the quiet partners that actually drive every stage of the protein metabolism. So, for digestion, we need an intact mucosal lining, and we need enzyme production and a healthy secretion. And all of the vitamins and minerals, not just one, are important for these processes. So we have B vitamins that are very useful for cellular metabolism, and then the liver amino acid processing. We have vitamin C and flavonoids that are really important for maintaining that the capillary and the mucosal integrity, which are really important when we're dealing with tissues that are under strain, or if they're under a lot of prolonged inflammation. And of course, we have other trace minerals, right? Zinc, magnesium, sulfur. They all form part of the enzyme structures, or at least catalyze the reactions for them to happen. And when we're under a lot of stress, our nutrient demand goes up too. So we start to burn through these nutrients a lot faster while we're trying to overcome or resist a strain. And so that adrenal activation increases the turnover of vitamin C and zinc and magnesium, and that can all put a strain on our endocrine system, our thyroid, our adrenal glands, these sort of things. It leads to micronutrient depletion, and then also can impact how our protein metabolism is, working. So when we see the digestive issues, poor protein status, we also got to start thinking about those micronutrient intakes. So we don't want to leave a gap here. They're very important for a lot of the enzymatic activities to occur. Now, once those amino acids get absorbed, they travel to the liver, through the portal vein, the control center, and that decides what's happening next. So the liver determines whether those amino acids become new proteins, or if they're burned for energy, whether they're converted into sugar or glucose, or if they're stored as fat. And that decision hinges on something called transamination and deamination. So this is where nitrogen is removed and converted into urea through the kidney. But you get this remaining carbon skeleton, and that's what can enter into the Krebs cycle for energy production, and then it can be repurposed depending on the needs. So it's a really important, cool thing the liver can do. So our metabolic demand, our hormonal state, our nutrient availability, they all influence how our amino acids are going to be used and how our energy production is going to occur. So that's why liver markers, energy status, and ensuring protein sufficiency, this is why they're all like interlinked or interconnected. And if that liver is under, a lot of strain, we're going to have issues even if that protein intake's good, right? Next, we'll talk about the stress and sex hormones. Most people are aware that they have a pronounced effect in our life. So during growth and adolescence, when teenagers, our thyroid hormones, our growth hormone is elevated typically. And that's because we're trying to build. We're building new tissues. We're trying to grow, right? In excess, though, those same hormones can also be catabolic, so they can break things down. So they can accelerate the tissue breakdown, protein breakdown, and even something called gluconeogenesis, how we break down glycogen to create glucose in the blood. Those sex steroids, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, those are also hormones that promote tissue protein accrual. So they're anabolic as well. And that's why you see so much of those rapid structural development through puberty and pregnancy. But those hormones start to decline as we age. They say it's normal, right? So when we get into menopause or andropause, that balance starts to shift. And instead of depending on those hormones, those sex hormones, our body starts to lean in a little bit more into those adrenal hormones, particularly cortisol, just to maintain our energy and our metabolic rate. So chronic stress can increase our cortisol output, as we all know, and what goes up must come down eventually. So over a prolonged period of time, that elevated cortisol starts to pull amino acids from the tissues, from our muscles, from our skin, joints, our gut, just to make glucose. And inevitably, that tissue can't maintain that increase in demand. And so the reservoirs start to get depleted. It's at this stage that it's not even just protein that starts to occur here. This is where you're also seeing micronutrient depletion as well. I see a lot of tissue selenium status deplete, a lot of zinc status deplete when someone has gone through this prolonged strain. So when we're assessing protein status, we also got to consider that hormonal context. Got to consider the stage of stress that someone's in, Hans Selye talked about, and the endocrine adaptation that starts to occur, and how that plays a major role in whether protein is being built up or breaking down in the body. Because if a person is depleted from chronic stress, they often have low sex steroid hormones, and they're often in that state of catabolism, right? They're breaking down, they're getting smaller. All right, so up to this point, we've been looking at mechanisms, digestion, liver, endocrine. Let's ground that with what we actually see and what we feel when protein starts to become insufficient. So because protein is present in nearly every structure and function, deficiency shows up across multiple different systems in often ways that seem unrelated. So insufficiency often travels with other deficiencies or other stress states. It's rarely the sole issue. So interpretation always happens in the broader terrain context. So when you're looking at the musculoskeletal system, you can see aches, weakness, poor recovery, joint pain, stiffness. That's synovial fluid, the cartilage, both of those are protein rich. And when our supply is low in the blood, they can be the area that our body compensates for and pulls from those tissues. We wonder why people get increased joint pain, right, as we get older. Skin and hair, we got dry skin, brittle nails, the hair shedding. This happens as the body starts to divert those resources from the surface level tissues to the deeper tissues in the body. There's also correlations with some homeopathic principles there. So you can also start to find these digestive issues. You get that post-meal bloat that I talked about. You can get a lot of gas from insufficient protein intake even. And we can get a slower repair with the digestive system. Neurologically, you get a lot of tingling and burning. For a while, I thought I was having some clients with some B6 issues because of the TGA stuff that's been going on. And we did have some issues with that, some people, but I found that a lot of protein insufficiency was causing a lot of irritability because they had that low amino acid availability, but then they also lacked those amino acids for the nerve sheath and the repairing of that. And then neurotransmitters that I talked about earlier, they can deplete because you need protein to make neurotransmitters. Again, our immune system also gets compromised because a lot of those immunoglobulin fractions are protein bases, and a fluid balance. And this is a really important one. Our fluid balance can start to change. So low albumin leads to a loss of something called oncotic pressure, and this can increase water retention. And you can see this in a lot of people's legs or in their belly. They start to get a lot of water retention, and it does show maybe some kidney issue, but this can happen with protein deficiency. So we don't want to overlook that one. Now, those proteins in the blood will often be compensated for, and we'll touch on that in a little bit. You might even see that some temporary irritation of the joints, as I said as well, when some of these things are starting to occur. So we don't want to just rely on labs alone. Now let's look at some labs though, because labs are going to be an important part here. Um, So there are usually about four key protein related markers that I'm usually looking at. First one, I'm looking at total protein, albumin, and globulin, and then the AG ratio, which you don't have to order this. This you can do mathematically. So albumin is produced by the liver, and it reflects both the liver production and also the overall protein availability for the body. And it can fluctuate with hydration or inflammation or even redistribution of protein. So oftentimes it's rare to find this out of balance in a very obvious way because the body's compensating and keeping the albumin look good. So the globulins include transport proteins and immune fractions. So their elevations often signal an immune response or some sort of ongoing inflammation. And then the ratio between the albumin and the globulin, a low ratio to me usually suggests like chronic inflammation is going on or maybe some impaired liver function. But if the ratio is high, albumin to globulin, then we're usually looking at like suppressed globulin production. So you're still looking at, compromised protein situations here. Now, total protein gives an overview, and a lot of people do, you'll see this in a lot of regular bloods. It's a lot less specific. So it's the context of the fractions that matter the most. And each marker will tell us a story. Together, they tell us a whole lot more than just a paragraph or a chapter. Now, beyond the protein panel, the complete blood count, we can, start to see things like normocytic anemia. And this isn't just from iron deficiency or B12 deficiency. We can get this normocytic anemia from insufficient protein as well, because we're unable to sustain just normal red cell production. Our lipid and thyroid panels also reflect protein status, lipoprotein I mentioned earlier, and also the assembly of thyroid production, thyroid hormones as well depend on protein. So if you're dealing with clients with like hypothyroidism, be sure to double check that you're looking at protein intake as well. Now, in the old days, I say this like I'm from the old days, but I guess I learned a lot from the older clinicians. We used to measure something called protein bound iodine. We don't do it anymore. Now we measure thyroid hormones that are, but protein bound iodine and thyroid hormones, they travel attached to proteins. So you can look at these thyroid hormones to assess metabolic drive. And that metabolic drive needs to be matched by protein intake to carry those hormones, right? So use it as like a secondary indication. All right. Now, if you really do suspect low protein, you probably won't find a whole lot with how a lot of our clientele, it's usually a little bit more emergency medicine. But if you're really not sure from a dietary recall, you can kind of just say like if they're consuming maybe like less than a gram per kilo of their body weight, then they certainly could have a compromised immune function or a compromised protein status. So then explore it from there. If their albumin's really low or they have a really low AG ratio, or a low urea or bun, because that's going to tell us the kidney aspect of that as well. So if those values rise with protein repletion, meaning you're giving more protein, it can actually confirm the deficiency that you suspected in the beginning rather than just a transient change. So those red flags that I talked about, if you're looking at protein, usually it's not showing us the true situation. It's definitely a compromise, a triage that's happening because the body is constantly redistributing the protein between different compartments to maintain that albumin in the blood. Clinically, you're going to see a lot of fatigue and mood decline and fragile tissues, or they really can't buffer from stress very well. Also be careful with dehydration because if someone is dehydrated, the proteins might look higher in the blood, but it's just like looking at a lake when the water is all evaporated. You might see more fish and think there's more there, but it's the same amount. And so we can get chemoconcentration if the water concentration in the blood drops. It might look like protein's better than it is. So let's still pull this all together. So first thing, we want to ensure that we're getting adequate intake and variety. So you can get that meat, eggs, dairy, legumes are the bigger sources, but for vegetarians, nuts, seeds, and even some of those high protein grains can be useful, but they don't come in with all of the essential amino acids. So be careful with that. Then you'll have to look at diversity. I like to use collagen in a way. I find that they're just easy to add in for most people's life, and it just works really well. Then you want to look at supporting that gastric and pancreatic digestion. So if there's a lot of signs of hypochlorhydria or poor enzyme output, at first I like to look at the meal rhythm. So get them as eating it right in the morning about 8 a.m. and regular meals to kind of get the rhythm back going. Thorough chewing as well. Sometimes short-term use of apple cider vinegar or even betaine HCl can be useful. Pancreatin is also can be useful. I talked about if the hydrochloric acid is not high enough, then there's no signal sent to the pancreas to then say, hey, we need more pancreatin. So we can supplement there if you're comfortable in doing that and educated to do it. Or in some cases, those measures can be a bit too aggressive. They get a lot of like heartburn, reflux by using those kind of products. You can always use like those broad spectrum digestive enzymes as well. Like the more, those are also really useful for this situation. And then, I mean, address micronutrient needs. In modern day, if you're not worried too much about personalized intake with like specific intakes, a broad spectrum multivitamin can cover this in a lot of situations. Um, from here, basically, then we like to look at the hepatic fat handling. This is where we're looking at choline-rich foods, or even choline as a supplement can be very useful as well. That's just to help with the methionine-rich proteins, or at least to generate choline, so that then we can transport these fats a little bit better around for improving our hormonal health and the fat accumulation in the liver, right? Um, I do a lot of hair testing, and with that, we can assess somebody's endocrine state. So we identify different patterns here. But for you guys, I would say like if you see someone that's running on like a lot of stress physiology, they have that really high cortisol, like hyperthyroidism, with very go 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 mentality. Um, you don't want to give them too much protein at once. Sometimes that can backfire, but they often do need some still. The oftentimes fats can be also useful to slow that person down. For like 80% of the people that I see, at least, most of them are like in chronic. Oh, there a lot of them are depleted. Probably, if you were to classify them in Henselius classification, it's like exhaustion stage of stress. So I usually see that very often with my clientele. Those individuals, we're looking at rebuilding the intake a little bit more slower and with a more progressed intake, so that they can see what works best for them. Usually, there's a lot of digestive issues along the way. And then we just monitor and adjust over time. Labs can be extra useful, but they're not always needed in when you're assessing protein status, unless it's really a progressed situation. Now, when you do start to do this, a lot of people will find that when you start to improve your protein metabolism, you can get early weight gain. You can start getting some weight gain. And that's not fat accumulation. It can be because it's water returning to protein dense tissues, which is a very important thing. We need water for communication and electrolyte activity. And so as our cells start to rebuild that internal protein structures, they'll naturally just start to attract and hold on to a little bit more water. So you will notice some edema, and sometimes like a visible edema. If you see that alongside low albumin, double check those the kidney function and liver function, and do your due diligence here. So we want to distinguish between constructive hydration or fluid stagnation, and that's an important one clinically to be mindful of. So once we start to improve our absorption of protein, you'll usually find more firm stools. That's usually a sign that the digestion and amino acid uptake are improving. So it's a very subjective thing. We don't need a lab to see improvements like that, right? We encourage hydration and fiber, and sometimes people do need a little bit of an aid to help with the bowels initially, especially if they struggle with that low thyroid function or something, because motility is slower, right? So consider using a little bit of laxatives or something to help move things along while you're working on these things. Those local protein stores I talked about, they get compromised. So the joints, the fascia, the connective tissue, they take time to replete. Our clients aren't always patient for that. Sometimes the pain can go up. Pain or stiffness often lags behind the systemic improvement. So just, we have to educate our clients here. These tissues have often been under resourced for like years. Like literally, I'm not average. I'm not kind of blowing that out of proportion. So rebuilding them also can take patience and might take a little while as well. So if a client starts to report that their digestion is getting a bit uncomfortable, they're a bit more gassy, but maybe their labs are improving, we still have to listen to them, but we have to slow things down. But it is a sign we're on the right track. So that systemic change precedes local comfort. That's why I said be careful when people go towards comfort. Comfort is not addressing a problem. So as protein sufficiency returns, you're going to find the water shifts, tissue hydration, and then maybe some delayed symptom resolution after that. Okay. So basically all the things that we talked about today, protein sufficiency is never about hitting a daily number. They can be useful, especially for assessing. We're not mathematical in that way. The train must be able to receive, process, and distribute that protein intelligently, from the intake to the liver function to the endocrine to the tissue repair. Everything works together, right? That's why we come at it in the systems approach rather than linear. And then we want to make sure that we're staying in that, at least that neutral nitrogen balance. Look for signs to see if we're in that negative nitrogen balance, fatigue, slow healing, these sort of things. And be careful when those labs look normal, because often they're compensations. We need to look at it with a little bit more of a clinical fine-tooth comb here. So when we listen to that chemistry, not just the numbers, we hear the body's intent, and that's where the meaningful care can begin as a practitioner. So thank you for joining me for this talk on protein, and I hope that this gives you a little bit more clear way to observe, measure, and support that in your practice.
You hear me, John?
Hey, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, John.
I just had a quick question about taking pure amino acids.
Cool. Yeah.
What is your opinion on that?
Oh, they put hair on my chest when I first tried it. Oh my goodness, they're not very yummy. They're very bitter and yucky for most people. So compliance is usually in the toilet. But for people with real compromised digestion, a lot of the time that can be sometimes the only entry point, depending on how the clientele that you work with. I do think that they can be really useful, but compliance, as I said, is not that great. So capsules, I find it a lot easier.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, no worries.
That was really
no
good,
question.
John. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, John, for your presentation. And we've had a few remarks saying it was an amazing talk.
Absolutely amazing presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.